4 generations of the family have run the brewery at Wainfleet, the third of those being George Bateman, who successfully fought to keep the business independent in the 1980s. In 1984, he chatted to Ed Lacey.
I was born in Wainfleet in the house, which is my office now. I lived there till the age of 6, and then we moved about 150 yards to the house in which I now live, and when I was married, moved from there to the house which is next door to Salem House, next door to the brewery, so that apart from having been in the army and various other things, it could be said I've never moved more than 150 yards.
Has Wainfleet changed very much over the years?
No, it hasn't. I think it's become a nicer place. I'm sure there was much greater division when I was a youth between the moneyed classes, the feudal landlords and so on, than there is now. But I think it has become a much nicer place, but it hasn't changed that much, honestly. I'd hoped to do chemistry at Cambridge, but it wasn't to be, and so I went into the army and spent 6 weeks at Ramby near Retford, being marched about and run about and having a fairly hellish time, but survived that and went on eventually through to officer training at Bovington near Bournemouth, and eventually into 1721st Lancers, where I landed up in Palestine. And in fact, we were one of the last regiments out of Palestine at the time of partition in 1948.
How long did you actually spend in the army?
I spent 3 years there. I should have been in, I was national service, obviously, and I should have been in for 2.5 years, but because we were out there in Palestine and we had sort of 6 months more to do, I signed on for another 6 months. I had done a month or two's actual brewery training, apart from the fact that all through school holidays from the age of about 7, I'd worked in our own brewery, bottling and on transport as I got older and so on and so forth. I actually did a month at Mowbray's of Grantham before I went into the army, which I must admit was a bit of a wangle, because by doing a month there before I went in the army, I was then able to count my army experience or my army years as going towards the next brewing exam I had to take, because one had to do sort of so many years before the next brewing exam. Then when I came out, I went to Greens of Luton, who have now become Whitbreads, to train under Bernard Dixon, who was one of the great mentors at that time, actually learning to brew. In those days, my father had to pay a considerable amount of money for the privilege of me being trained. I was very fortunate indeed, because they took over Kelsey's of Tunbridge Wells, and at Kelsey's I was in fact sort of acting second brewer, because the second brewer was being taken to Luton to be inculcated with their new ideas. And so I was actively, although only a trainee, the second brewer, and I had a great time there. In fact, they had the greatest difficulty in getting me to go back from Tunbridge Wells to Luton when my 6 months was up. But we had a very interesting head brewer there, an enormous chap of about 6'3", but about 22 stone. And I would ask him a question in the evening over a glass of beer, something to do with brewing, and he'd always say, "I'll tell you in the morning, my boy." And of course, what it meant was that he'd go to his brewing book that evening and tell me what the answer was in the morning. A time I still look back on with considerable pleasure.
So when was it that you actually came back to the family brewery here in Wainfleet?
So I came back to Wainfleet in 1950, and then I was sort of assistant brewer for a year or two, which was very interesting because I had been trained in a more scientific manner. I mean, our head brewer had joined the company in 1927, the year in which I was born, and by that time, I mean, he was, I suppose, in his early 60s, and I was trained in more scientific methods. And so the first thing I did was sort of test various of our beers for the pH or the acidity of it. And I said to him one day, I said, "You know, that mild beer, it really can't go out. Its pH is far too low." And so, you know, I said, "It must be sour." So he and I tasted every jolly cask. And in fact, it was super beer. So it proved to me straight away that science isn't always right as far as brewing is concerned, that it's an art as well as a science. And he was absolutely right. It was super beer. There was another interesting thing came up about that time, because in those days there was much more mild drunk than bitter. Mild was ale, and every pub had ale, but not many actually had bitter or beer at that time. So there was a complaint came back from the Foresters' Arms at Mareham that the ale was sour. occasion. So I went over and tasted it and saw old Mrs. Roberts, and I said to her, no, it's perfectly good beer, it's just that we put some new hops in and therefore the hops are a bit more bitter. So that the message came back fairly smartly a day or two later, or put the old bees back again then. At that time, which we're talking about 1950, 51, 52, we were still fermenting the beer in the very, very old-fashioned farmhouse manner. In other words, we were fermenting the beer in the particular cask or barrel in which the beer would go out. But I have to admit now that there were many occasions in the middle of the summer that we were sending out beer at 80 degrees Fahrenheit and telling our customers that they ought to be keeping it at 56 Fahrenheit. And to be honest, there were 3 or 4 summers as a young man when I might have been enjoying myself in Skegness that I hardly dared go out, and certainly not to a Bateman pub, but one just had to sort of grin and bear it. But since those days, I mean, in fact, I think it's 1954, we put air conditioning into the brewery, or into the fermenting part, cooled sterile air. And I think if we hadn't done that, I don't think we should have lasted that summer through.
In a rural area such as Lincolnshire, it's obviously been quite important for you as the local brewer to maintain local pubs as almost the social centre of some of the smaller villages. Has this been difficult?
It may have been difficult, but of course, I mean, this has been my whole philosophy. Here, living amongst everybody in Lincolnshire, of course we're interested in the local communities, which of course have become rather depopulated with the lack of labour required by the farmers now. But there still are the communities, and the only social centre for those communities is the pub. Obviously, first of all, each pub must be a living for the tenant of the pub. The last thing I'd want to do would be to ever let a pub to anybody if I thought that they could not make the sort of living that they would be hoping to make. But having said that, so far as we're concerned, with 80 pubs, some are better than others profit-wise, and I am very, very keen that the one social centre for the village community should be there and should be preserved.